tomorrow's budget might address?
Yeah. So I think we have moved from what the previous Minister of Finance referred to as fiscal consolidation towards what we now, or at least in his last term, referred to as fiscal sustainability. What that means is that we had our debt grew too quick, too fast, and he then obviously consolidated fiscal expansion and subsequently managed debt, where it has now stabilized around 60% to debt to GDP, which is a fairly good reflection of the Namibian economy at this point. Our revenue base have not grown as quickly as we have wanted to, but obviously that's got to do with the huge unemployment rate that we have. But I think one needs to applaud NAMRA for the splendid work they have done in the collection, especially around efficiencies, the carrot and stick approach, and that has sort of stabilized government revenues under the same period as well. Over and above that, you have seen that there's been a huge appropriation over time that has flown towards education and health in the social sector, if it were. We had not enjoyed the satisfactory outcomes in respect of education. If the grade 12 or the advanced subsidiary and the core grade 11 results that we had in the beginning of the year, this year, is anything to go by, it tells you that we have really not moved the needle in a manner that we should have, given the allocation that has flown. Now, obviously, that has not sort of brought down the high unemployment rate. It has not dealt with the high poverty levels. It has also not dealt with the poverty, with the inequality that exists. So why this budget tomorrow is so critical and so difficult to predict is because, one, the new Minister of Finance came in on Saturday, or was announced on Saturday, or over the weekend, if it were. And the budget that's being presented, one would think, is the budget that went through the process, which went through the budget process with the former Minister of Finance, Tate Pumbu. And what you then have is, through that, there was the SWAPO implementation plan or manifesto, as we know it now. And one would want to see whether that particular plan of the SWAPO manifesto found its way through the budget process before the change in guard. And so it will be a very interesting budget statement tomorrow, because on the one side, in the implementation plan, you do see quite a heavy spending trend, if it were, but a heavy spending trend that appears to be geared towards job creation and dealing with the poverty levels and. However, one needs to be careful, given that the revenue base has not necessarily expanded greatly. So there could be a move towards potential borrowing, or obviously subject to what the budget would say. So I'm quite curious to know the balancing act that Madam, the Honorable Finance Minister, Madam Shafuda, will work tomorrow.
On the newly appointed Minister Shafuda, that you alluded to earlier, who actually has over 20 years experience in Treasury, Salomo, I want to know how strategic, in your view, her appointment as Finance Minister is, and also what are some of the perceived changes that she might bring to this portfolio?
Yeah. So I think the Honorable Madam Shafuda has been with Treasury, as you rightfully pointed out, for 20 years, and also in a very high-profile portfolio as the Executive Director or the then Permanent Secretary. So she does have the institutional memory around Treasury and how Treasury function. But remember now that we had 21 ministries. Obviously, that's if you include both the Director General and the Minister in the Presidency. And what we have now is the 14 ministries that have been merged. So, for instance, a ministry like Agriculture and Land Reform has now been merged with another big ministry, which is the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources.
Yes.
Now, those are critical ministries in terms of the NDP of government in respect of anchoring the economic fortunes of Namibia. They have been now combined. So with those two ministries, one would want to understand what exactly the Minister of Finance will do in realizing the objectives or the mandates of those two ministries that has become one. Another ministry that we really need to keep our eye on, and which has historically enjoyed a huge appropriation of the budget allocation, was the Ministry of Higher Education and Basic Education, which now have also been merged, but brought in other ministries, which is the Ministry of Sport, Youth, and Innovation. So these are becoming, perhaps for a lack of a better word, what we can refer to as super ministries. Super ministries in terms of the mandate, but also in terms of how they can have a direct impact in terms of some of the challenges that we are facing. You know that we're sitting with a huge youth unemployment, which is almost close to 50%, around 44%. And that is quite high. And the Ministry of Youth, and if you read the implementation plan that speaks to the establishment of youth empowerment schemes, it also speaks about a youth fund. Now, we would want to see what the Minister of Finance sort of what her role, or rather how she will balance the allocation to those ministries, especially in relation to wanting to address the challenges that we face as a country in respect of poverty, youth unemployment. Obviously, another one that we need to keep our eye on as well is the Ministry of Health. Obviously, there's also a new ministry. So all the sort of previously ministries that had a huge appropriation appears to have now new ministers. And that will make for an interesting take in terms of the allocation and how you also align the allocation with what perhaps the implementation plan that we now think will become the rollout for the budget statement will look like. So, Madam Shafuda would really...
Let me just interject there quickly, Salomo. In view of this reduced cabinet and the merging of these super ministries, as you titled them, do you think we'll see then a slimmer budget, or will there be more money allocated for greater funding for these ministries to carry out their mandates?
Well, and this is what we hope the budget will tell us tomorrow, because remember that on the one side, obviously, the minister falls away, so you have one minister, right? But remember that what happened to the directorates in the ministries? Do they all move together? What happened to the different deputy directors in the different ministries? So these are all the reorganization that will come as a consequence of that. So at a very high level, there is definitely a move towards streamlining and perhaps bringing greater coordination at ministerial level, which perhaps could increase efficiencies, and through that you could potentially have some sort of a saving purely on or at the ministerial level from a cost perspective. But now, in terms of what happens to the different departments or directorates in terms of the staff members, I don't think those ones will be laid off. We would want to understand what happens to them. For instance, remember that the Ministry of Trade and Industrialization is now going to be merged with the Ministry of Mines and Energy, right? So what that means is that does it mean the whole industrial ministry in terms of the industrialization component moves there, or which component of the Ministry of Trade and Industry moves there, especially in relation to the different subcomponents? Then you have to consider the different SOEs that report into the different ministries in terms of the mandate. What happens there? for instance, BIPA, does BIPA move to Ministry of Mines and Energy? Because obviously that becomes industry. And you look at another institution like the Competition Commission, for instance, what happens to them? Do they, as an institution, do they move to the Mines and Energy, or where do they move to? The other interesting one would also be the new state-owned enterprise that Her Excellency the President spoke about, that will now be in charge of all state assets. Essentially, all the state assets will be now on that balance sheet. It would be interesting to really find out exactly what happens. So at this stage, it's extremely difficult to draw a line around the saving that could come as a consequence of the merging, because some of the substructures and the different directorates, we will only be able to get clarity as we move along, and hopefully the budget statement tomorrow set the tone for that.
President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah has been quite vocal about curbing unemployment, and it's high on her agenda as one of the pointers and things that she aims to do as a matter of urgency. What sectors do you think require investments to ensure job creation?
Yeah. So look, Nina, I think we have really spoken about the agriculture sector due to its labor intensity absorption capacity, right? There's been quite huge public investment that has flown towards that sector. Remember that we have built the green schemes with the hope that it will be a huge job multiplier. Regrettably, that has not happened due to the schemes not having been optimized. Obviously, there has been a move to revive and sort of accelerate their delivery in the past year under Madam Diakupi, who's the ED there. So that remains an important sector. And also, if you look at other sectors or other products or other sub-industries within the sector. For instance, the grapes down south has been a huge success story. And again, that's huge labor intensity that has taken place there. So the idea is to replicate some of those successes to the other sub-industries or to the other sort of areas where public investment has flown towards, to be able to export and subsequently create the necessary jobs. So agriculture remains an important one. Another important one is really education, because education provides the throughput on which labor profiles or labor skill sets are built on. If you don't have a very good education outcome, it would mean that you would not have employable labor force. And regrettably, if you look at the statistics today, the majority of those that are employed are essentially grade 12s, right? So we need to work, or rather we need to have proper planning and proper understanding around what exactly, where do the skills gap, or where does the bridge fall off between what we want to see as quality throughput into the job market. So education obviously becomes a key component, because essentially this is a throughput for the labor force. So in the absence of the lack of quality of throughput that's coming through, you would always have the problem of the unemployment. Obviously, other sectors like the logistics sector, which is non-port essentially, or the port operations. You know that with the emergence now of the not so new industry, which is the oil and gas, a lot of activity will be concentrated on the ports. So we definitely need to look at creating decentralized hubs outside of port operations. So, for instance, Keetmans, which is quite close to Lutherets, we need to understand what port activities can be created there. You want to see some sort of port activity in the areas around Hobabes and Grootfontein. And generally, the uptake in ship repairs, the docking of vessels, that will mean definitely new jobs will be created there, but subsequently there's also a certain level of skills that's required to be able to make sure that they can be absorbed. Now, in respect of mining, there's been a lot of FDI that has flown towards or into the country on the back of the exploration around oil and gas. But we also know that that is essentially capital intensive and doesn't necessarily create jobs in the initial stages.
Yeah.
We hope that with a local content policy, some of the value chains can be geared towards Namibians, which will then be targeted towards creating the necessary jobs. So there's a collective approach that needs to be taken in really addressing the job deficit that we currently have, and subsequently the budget statement will most probably give us an idea of what the theme is with the new administration.
Salomo, what signals could the budget send to, local and international investors about Namibia's commitment to effective fiscal management, especially with the recent leadership change?
Well, I think it will give the international investors a peep into the policy direction in terms of where Namibia is going. It will give the investors a sense of assurance, if it were. Remember that the Eurobond is now coming up this year. I think the budget statement will speak to that, whether we'll be able to honor the obligations this year. And through that, you would be able to send signals to the international investors. Obviously, it's equally important for the local investors to also understand the funding or the borrowing plan or the funding strategy of government going into the future. And this will be a good precursor to really give them a sense of what the new government, if it were, is planning. Now, obviously, there's a real sense that Namibians need to deal with the issues of poverty, inequality, and the youth unemployment, which is really becoming a concern. So the signal that will go to whether it's domestic or international investors will also have to be taken into context of where the current domestic challenges are and what government intends to do about that.
Mr. Salomo Hei, it was a pleasure having you with us once again. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that was economist and economic commentator Salomo Hei speaking to us there, anticipating what we can possibly expect with tomorrow's budget tabling happening in Parliament. When we come back after this brief break, our conversations to continue, so stay with us. You were supposed to play African News Stinger. Did you forget?